Okay, class, this is chapter 3, part 2. We're going to be focusing on carbohydrates. So, with these, you want to know sort of their categories, what they're calling varieties. You want to know their characteristics, and you want to know their functions, and then you want to know a few examples. I'll let you know the ones you need to know. So carbohydrates, their function mostly is for energy. Your body's going to eat carbs before it consumes the lipids. And I'm not talking about your digestive tract. I'm talking about your actual cells that make up your body. They prefer to eat carbohydrates over lipids or proteins or nucleic acids. As a matter of fact, your body is going to prefer to eat glucose, which is a specific carbohydrate. And they will use glucose to make ATP. And ATP is going to be the main energy molecule of the cell. We'll use ATP to do work within the cell. Some carbohydrates are also structural. You know, people have probably told you, or you may have overheard it, but you need to eat fiber in your diet. That fiber is basically structural plant material that makes up the plant cell wall. So that's an example of a structural one. We'll get into that a little bit more detail later. So those are the two functions. So they can be used to make ATP for energy, or they can be structural. Their main characteristic, all their monosaccharides have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So glucose, you multiply through that ratio by 6, and you at least have the formula for glucose. Which is C6H12O6. So it's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The three types of carbs, you have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Mono means 1, di means 2, and poly means many. This word saccharide means sugar, like table sugar. A monosaccharide is a single sugar. It's also called a simple sugar. I would generally also call disaccharides simple sugars. So when nutritionists or doctors say avoid simple sugars, that's what they're talking about, are the monosaccharides and disaccharides. The biggest, most famous monosaccharide is glucose. So definitely no glucose. It is blood sugar, and again, it's what your body is going to eat first. There's also fructose, which is fruit sugar. If your body eats fructose, fructose is an isomer of glucose. If your body eats if your body eats fructose, it will turn it into glucose and then eat the glucose. So that's how much your body prefers glucose. And then we'll see ribose and deoxyribose. We'll talk about them more in nucleic acids, DNA. But those are pretty much your monosaccharides that we'll deal with in the body. Galactose is in lactose, but that's really the only place we see it, so I'm probably not going to ask you about it. But I will definitely ask you about glucose. I might ask you about fructose. So this looks like glucose. But all our monosaccharides will either be a 6-sided ring or a 5-sided ring. At least quite a few of them. And they'll have a lot of hydroxyl groups. Which means they're polar. And similarly to the 5-sided ones, you'll have a lot of hydroxyl groups attached. Disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides linked together by the dehydration synthesis reaction. So there'll be one covalent bond between those 2 monosaccharides. The most famous one is sucrose, and that's because it is table sugar. It is composed of 1 glucose plus 1 fructose, so those 2 are bound together. Lactose is also pretty famous because of lactose intolerance. It is milk sugar, and it is glucose with galactose. But definitely know sucrose, know how it's built, and then know that lactose is also a disaccharide. So sucrose and lactose are disaccharides. But for lactose, just know that it's milk sugar. So here our monosaccharides are separate. Here they're linked together. So these are 2 monosaccharides, and this is a single disaccharide. And here's the covalent bond that links them together. Notice that is absent over here. So if we're going in this direction, we're doing dehydration synthesis. If we're going back in this direction, we would be doing hydrolysis. And that's what I just said. And here's a close-up view of the disaccharide. So we have 2 rings, 2 6-sided rings linked together by a covalent bond. Polysaccharides are next. These 2, starch and glycogen, are basically just storage forms of glucose. So it's a bunch of glucose linked together so your body can store it and hang on to it for when it's needed. These other 3 are structural. I really only want you to know these 2. So you do need to know 4 polysaccharides, 4 examples of polysaccharides. But let's start with these 2. So starch and glycogen are just storing glucose. The difference is that starch is in plants and glycogen is in animals. When you think about plants, a lot of times the starch is in a grain like rice or corn, or it's in the root like a tuber like potatoes. Glycogen is going to be stored in your liver and in your muscles. The glycogen in your liver is for the entire body. The glycogen in your muscles is just for the muscles. But both of those are storage forms of glucose. They'll just be long chains of glucose. Some starch is just a single chain. But some starch branches, and then glycogen is a branching chain always. Alright, so that leaves us with cellulose and chitin. You do say that like a K, even though there's a CH. Cellulose is in the cell wall of plants. It's very structural, and it's basically fiber. Chitin is in the cell walls of fungi and the exoskeleton of insects. So you've probably felt or heard, based on like clicking noises, how hard chitin is. It can be pretty tough. But chitin is structural. It's also a polysaccharide. So starch and glycogen are polysaccharides. They're for energy. Cellulose and chitin are polysaccharides. They're structural. They're commonly found in cell walls. And this is just showing you the structure. So here's the linear starch, and here's the branching one. And here you can see how glycogen branches. And then this is showing you cellulose. Cellulose is a bunch of chains that have been cross-linked. So they're all linked together, and in this way they'll make a net-like structure. And that's how they're so tough and protective, are these two directional covalent bonds.